What's up, guys? Sci-Hi here for another deck analysis of a deck that I think is strong enough to get to Mythic and go all the way. It's none other than, of course, the Esper Reanimator deck. We'll take a look at all the card choices here and explain different nuances of the deck and some of the thought behind my picks here. But just to recap, it's early November in the season. Last season we were rolling with the Infinite Squirrels combo, which is still a great deck, but let's be honest, it can be a bit of a slog to click through that many triggers and find a lot of new bugs and just kind of push Magic Arena to its limits, and the mirror match is supreme hell. So this is what I got cooking up right now for the start of the new November best of one historic season. Pushed into Diamond quickly, but we're going to try to push into Mythic here as soon as we can. But first, let's take a look at the deck. Of course, it is Esper Reanimator. Obviously, if you're familiar with this deck, the main goal we're trying to do is put massive, just horrific monsters into play that our opponent cannot deal with and get them to tap out as fast as possible. So taking a look in the one casting cost spot, we've got Otherworldly Gaze, a rather new card, but a lot of people have figured out that this is surely a staple in this archetype, where this is a card where we're not actually going to be drawing any cards with Otherworldly Gaze, but we're going to be looking at the top three, kind of scrying, and the fact that, of course, it's got flashback means we can just dig up to 6 cards quickly, find what we need. Most often you're going to be dumping as much as possible, whether you're digging, trying to get to one of your threats, or you're looking for critical land drops and you're kind of using it more as like a scry card. But just a great card to dump things in our graveyard and fill it up as fast as possible. Also in the one drop, we've got the beloved Stitcher's Supplier, which has been a staple in many graveyard decks for quite some time now, even in Modern as well. But this, again, a similar effect. When this zombie comes into play or dies, we get to mill 3 cards, which is just great. We're looking to put in our big monsters in the graveyard so that we can reanimate them. Also, it's really good to have just kind of 1/1 quick drops. Even though it is just a 1/1, but we can pressure planeswalkers with this. We can chump block. Does everything you want it to do, especially in the early game. Then moving on to the 2 casting cost cards, we've got another relatively new card in Faithful Mending, which is, of course, white and blue's kind of version of Faithless Looting. But people are very familiar with this card by now, but we're gaining 2 life. We're drawing 2 cards and discarding 2 cards, and then it can flash back and do the exact same thing again. So this is, again, great for digging. And we want to have a healthy number of cards that allow us to discard cards when we have our big monsters in our hand. We want to get them into the graveyard, so we need to have outlets to do so, and that's what these enablers, these types of cards do. It's good to have a healthy amount of these so we can discard the monsters in our hand when we need to. Then another card which I think should be a staple in this deck. I'm surprised to not see a lot of lists wanting to run 4 of them for a variety of reasons, but to me this is just your redundancy. Priest of Fellrites is kind of like your second copy of Unburial Rites, but there's some interesting applications with this card. With Priest of Fellrites, you can get a large threat and reanimate something as early as turn 3, which is something that Unburial Rites just can't do. Of course, this is a little bit more vulnerable, being that it's a creature, but it does have kind of a big target on its back. It must be answered immediately, or it's going to do its thing. It's going to reanimate some horrific creature from your graveyard and terrorize your opponent, or at least hopefully that's the plan. But the interesting thing about Priest of Fellrites, being that it has Unearth, similar to Flashback, but with the game rules, this can't be countered. They can't use a counter spell to counter your activation of Unearth. So against some control decks, this can kind of get underneath them and surprisingly actually reanimate things into play when Unburial Rights would not be able to. So, but again, moreover, it's just this is your second copy of the plan of just being able to reanimate things. So to me, it's an auto 4 of inclusion. It's been great for me. It's great even when you don't have it in your hand and you're just flipping it into the graveyard with Otherworldly Gaze and having to wait until turn 5 once you reach 5 mana to use its Unearth ability and get a creature into play that way. Of course, it does come at the loss of 3 life, which can be relevant, but that's how we roll. That's how we roll. You know, we gotta get these big creatures into play somehow. So this is very much a staple, I believe, in the deck. But moving on, in the 3-drop spot, we've got a couple of copies of Thirst for Meaning. Not a whole lot to say. Again, this is a digging card. We're digging and trying to discard cards. Discard our big monsters into the graveyard. So we've got 2 copies of this. And then another relatively new card that I've just started experimenting with and been quite happy with so far. We've got You Find the Villain's Lair. Now this is quite versatile. We can either counter a spell or draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. And this fits in the deck perfectly. It's a great feeling when you can reanimate something and have backup counter spells to protect it. That can go a long ways. But again, just more redundancy and versatility and being able to dig and discard cards. This area has kind of been a flex spot for me where I've been experimenting with other things like Test of Talents or whatever the card is that counters instant or sorcery, and you get to search their deck and remove all of them. That can be good against other combo decks or removing Emergent Ultimatum. But I recently just settled on this card because I saw the versatility is really valuable to have that option to counter something when the situation arises. But there are times when it's critical that you maybe have a way to reanimate something, but you have nothing in your graveyard, and you absolutely just need to discard or pitch something in your hand to reanimate it. So this has been a good card. Again, it's kind of a flexible area to experiment with things with other cards, but this has been working out quite well so far. Moving on in the 5-drop spot, of course, we've got the staple of the deck, Unburial Rights, which I've talked about a little bit already. A lot of times you'll be pitching this early, discarding it, and looking to cast it for its flashback cost, which is 1 less at 4 mana, and hopefully reanimating something really strong on the 4th turn. But again, just a great card. The inevitability is what I'm really going for here. I'm hyper-focused on just trying, similar to the last deck analysis I did, I'm not trying to prepare for every possible thing, but I'm just trying to do one really powerful thing consistently and inevitably. And I think this deck has performed quite well, at least with that plan so far. Moving on to something more interesting, taking a look at our monster choices for this deck. Probably of no surprise, Serra's Emissary. I've got 4 copies of this. This card has just been an absolute monster in Historic. You may have run into it in the ladder and be already very familiar with it, but not even just in this deck archetype, but in Jeskai control lists that cheated into play with other means. This card is just an absolute monster to deal with. It can shut down creature decks so badly. The powerful effect of giving yourself and all creatures you control protection from a card type of your choice is extremely powerful against other aggro creature decks. Just choosing creature often shuts them down completely, and there's nothing they can do. They can't block your guys. Their creatures no longer deal any damage to you. It's an absolute shutdown. Again, not to pick on elves, but this absolutely destroys elves because they traditionally aren't running removal right now, at least in the generic lists that we see in top ladder games. So again, this is just an absolute monster. Really interesting card. Most of the time, when in doubt, you're going to be choosing creature for this. There are times against control when you have to assess the situation. Can certainly be tricky, and you kind of have to speculate about what your opponent has and how they might be able to kill this. But when in doubt, creature I think is usually your best option if you're not sure. But interesting thing about choosing creature with Serra's Emissary, maybe you may worry about going up against a food deck or a sacrifice deck, and having that black priest card that can they sack 2 creatures and force you to sacrifice a creature. But that actually is not a way to kill this, because when you have protection from creatures, they can't target you with that card. They have to target their opponent and force them to sacrifice the creature. So just this is an absolute monster of a card. It ends games on the spot. Extremely powerful auto 4 inclusion. And then for the other 4 inclusion, which may be a little bit surprising, but I'm absolutely bullish on this card, Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger, may appear kind of strange. I've seen a lot of lists running maybe just 1 or 2, but I've got the full 4, and so far I'm staying with it. I've seen enough situations and games, game states where this absolutely gets you out of difficult situations. It's important to have kind of a backup plan, and Ulamog is our backup plan. Or like a plan B to win the game, so to speak. There are a lot of instances where, right now on the ladder, where you may get completely locked out by the white prison decks that use Solemnity and 9 lives, and they're preventing all damage. But Ulamog just doesn't care about that. It gets around it. When you attack, you're exiling the top 20 cards of their library, so you can just mill them. So if you can't kill them, you just mill them. You know the old saying, mill them or kill them. And so this, you'd be surprised how many times I've actually milled opponents so far, just early in the ladder here in November. But this guy is just a house. It's kind of a pet card of mine. I love this back in the modern Eldrazi list, and even going back to Legacy, getting him into play rather quickly. Of course, when you're casting him, it can be absolutely backbreaking to exile 2 permanents. I speculate some people may shy away from using him, and it doesn't seem like an obvious card to include in a Reanimator list, because since we're cheating him into play by reanimating him, of course we're not going to get that when you cast a spell exile 2 target permanents trigger. So we're not going to get to do that, which is, that sucks, but it's really not that big of a deal, because his other statistics, his stats are so powerful. A lot of decks they cannot deal with an early 10/10 indestructible. I mean, that sounds silly to say. Of course they can't, because it's a 10/10 indestructible. But a lot of the common removal just can't hit Ulamog. There's a lot of 5-color interesting kind of tribal decks floating around right now that run the white-black spell to exile a mono-colored permanent, and that can't hit this because Ulamog has no color. He's not a mono-colored permanent. So there's a lot of surprising situations where Ulamog is just amazing and can win games that you would otherwise be locked out of winning from. Another thing is, we're choosing creatures that we want to be as good in as many matchups as possible. But in best of 1, of course, we're not sideboarding, so we have to think about things a little bit differently. We're trying to use cards that have the widest, range of being successful and good and valuable, and I believe Ulamog does. Again, because he gets you out of those situations where you can't win by damage and you need to mill your opponent. Also in the mirror match, or other decks that run Serra's Emissary, you can get in these strange situations where both players have protection from creatures, and suddenly you're in this weird, awkward stalemate where nobody can deal damage to each other. But Ulamog, again, he doesn't care, because even if they have protection from creatures, just this thing triggers on attack. He triggers on attack, so when you attack, you're exiling the top 20 cards of their deck. And that's only 2 hits, sometimes less, depending on how the game has developed, where you're going to kill them, and you're just going to completely mill their deck very quickly. So Ulamog, again, very bullish on this card. I think I think it's solid. It wins a lot of games. There's a lot of other honorable mentions. People have run Elish Norn, which again is I agree is a amazing card. Giving all of your opponent's creatures -2/-2 is awesome, and against creature decks that can win on the spot as well. However, a card like that is not as good in the mirror. And I've been in situations in the mirror where my opponent has had that, and I've had Ulamog, and they just look silly because, oh, I have an 8/8 Ulamog, but so what? Your entire deck's getting milled, and you're dying. So, again, awesome card. I really love it. I can't speak enough about Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger. One of my favorite Magic cards of all time, actually. Fun fact, bonus fact. But lastly, our last 9th monster. It's quite an interesting one. Sheoldred Whispering One, the Phyrexian Praetor. This thing is absolutely bonkers. So you may be familiar with the card Abyss back from way back in the day from Legends. Just an awesome card, forcing our opponent to sacrifice a creature every upkeep can be backbreaking for creature decks early. Then it has just the fun bonus ability of at the beginning of our upkeep, we get to reanimate another creature. So this can get out of control and often just wins the game by itself if it comes down early. But again, more importantly, in the mirror match, which is something you should always think about when you're building a deck, like what would my mirror matchup look like, or what would be good in the mirror, or how are other people going to beat me? What are the most valuable cards going to be? I believe this card has a fit here. In the mirror match, this thing is awesome. Again, in situations we talked about earlier where people cast or they get Sarah's Emissary in play and name creature, suddenly everybody has got protection from creatures, so you can't target or hit anything. We don't run any removal anyways, but they don't know that. They don't know our deck list. So Sheoldred is the only way we can kind of get out of a mirror match situation where we both have Sarah's Emissary in play as well. We force them to sacrifice it. Or maybe they have an Ulamog and there's no way to kill it other than, or at least one way is forcing them to sacrifice it. So another fun card, just a one of here. I'm not going too crazy on this. I'm trying to maximize what I believe are the two most critical creatures. And number one is Sarah's Emissary. In most situations, this is what you want in play. This is what's going to win you the game. In other situations, and against a lot of prison decks, Ulamog is going to be your kind of plan B for victory. If we can't kill them with damage, we're going to mill them to death, or at least exile their entire library and kill them that way. Lastly, in the mana area, nothing too crazy. Again, I'm not trying to do anything overly complicated. I've got no man lands, the so-called man lands here. I've just got a suite of all the shock lands and all the switch lands for the Esper colors. Then we've got one 25th land in a basic island for style points. And also we're running 25 lands because it is important to get to the 4 and 5 mana base so we can actually cast our Unburial Rites, so we can actually unearth our priests and do our thing. So we don't want to miss land drops, and we also really, it's important that we have all 3 colors. A lot of times we want to get to 2 blue. That's the only really real requirement where we are focusing on what land we want to get 2 of. But we also, of course, have lots of kind of pseudo brainstorm effects in Otherworldly Gaze, where we can help scry and get the lands we need. So you can keep a lot of different hands depending on what is in your hand. If you can dig, maybe you don't have the tools you need, but you can dig. Every situation is different, but we'll get into that when we once I put out the actual gameplay and strategy video as we attempt to climb back into Mythic as fast as possible. I think we're sitting at Diamond Tier 2 or 3 right now. But we'll get back there soon and put out another video of the gameplay. But yeah, the mana base is a work in progress. Again, 25 lands. There are some situations where if your opponent is running heavy graveyard hate, in a best of one situation where we're kind of a little bit hosed at that point, depending on the type and severity of their graveyard removing effects. Like Rest in Peace is, of course, the all-time greatest graveyard hate card, in my opinion, just for pure shutdown of graveyard effects. But if that is the case, that our graveyard does get shut down by the opponent, we at least, we're not completely dead or out of the game by any means, but we do have to kind of switch gears and focus on just hitting land drops. And a lot of decks that do shut down our graveyards can be slower control decks, so that's at least the bright side, the silver lining. If our graveyard is removed, we want to just focus on hitting land drops, getting enough land in play, and then we actually have to start actually hard casting these big monsters. It's not impossible. I've actually won some strange situation games playing through Grafdigger's cages, just surviving, hanging on with gain life effects, chump blocking, getting to 10 mana, ultimately casting Ulamog and removing their Grafdigger's cages or whatever flavor of graveyard hate they have, and just playing actually fair Magic at that point and actually casting things. So it's not unwinnable, but obviously we don't want to see graveyard hate on the ladder, and starting to become, at least in the meta right now at November 4th, it's, in my experience, it's starting to look more prevalent. But anyways, we'll look at those different situations in the next video coming out, where we actually look at the gameplay. But anyways, that's the decks. That's the deck, the basics of it, and at least my philosophy on it. If you like this, please subscribe, like, do all that bullshit on YouTube. It helps. You know, it's the most cliche, stupid thing everybody says, but it helps us get off the ground as this channel is just getting started. And we look forward to grinding the ladder, looking at real strong strategy, and trying to think about all the nuances of every card to give you the best shot at getting into top mythic play and winning lots of games. So again, guys, thanks for listening. I'm Sci High. Talk to you later. Peace.